Joining me now is Eleanor Shearer. She's a senior researcher at the think tank Commonwealth. Eleanor, thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
What do you make of this national insurance tax cut from Hunt?
Ultimately, it's disappointing. We're at a point in this country where public services are absolutely on their knees after 14 years of huge underinvestment. So for the government to be prioritising giveaways, and giveaways that are regressive, they disproportionately benefit the better off, rather than prioritising public investment, is not the solution to the UK's long-standing low growth and sluggish productivity.
So what would be a better way of using this money then? Because it's about £10 billion. If you had to play with £10 billion to reinvigorate productivity, to get the economy going again, what would you do?
The place I'd start is strategic public investment. And I guess a great place to start in particular is in clean energy. So Commonwealth put out some research in February that was looking at the impact of public investment in the transition to renewable energy. The problem there is that at the moment, the government now and Labour possibly in future are leaning quite heavily on the idea that the private sector will be financing things like offshore wind. But we know that when the private sector has to finance these things, they're more expensive. Ultimately, that translates to higher costs on energy bills. So if I had £10 billion to play with, probably the place I'd start is putting it in some kind of publicly funded energy generator that would direct that public investment to make sure that we get better renewable energy and increase our energy security, so that if there's other energy price shocks in future, like we've just had over the last couple of years, the UK would be in a stronger position.
Well, I hope Rachel Reeves is listening to that. The Tories were saying that they would like to initially have done a cut to income tax. How much more would that have cost? Because, of course, what we're hearing is they were put off from doing that by the OBR, saying it was simply unaffordable. I mean, 10 billion is a lot of money. So how much would we have been looking at if they'd cut income tax?
Well, ultimately, there are a few different considerations with the cut to income tax. I can't give you an exact figure on how much more it would have cost, but I think what's important to recognise here is that all these things about the OBR saying, will this or will this not be affordable for the government? It's important to talk about Hunt's fiscal rules. So we're not dealing here with some kind of naturally preordained limits on what government can and cannot spend. What we're ultimately dealing with is the government saying, we want debts to be falling at the end of this forecast, and that's what's tying our hands. So when they're talking about whether they'll cut this tax or that tax, and whether they have the fiscal headroom to do that, what they're ultimately talking about is this idea that they want debt to be falling in the fifth year of the Parliament. And that's just not ultimately a great way to be making economic policy. Rather than balancing this national insurance cut against this projected cuts to public spending, the projected rises to fuel duty that, as you pointed out, haven't happened since 2011. Rather than basing our economic policy on these fictions, we should be thinking about what is actually going to transform the economic fate of this country. We should be thinking about how we put more money into public services to get better growth.
And the worry with cutting income tax was that it might actually feed into inflation because, of course, there'd be significantly more money in people's pockets. They would spend that. Consumer demand would rise, and therefore we'd see a rise in inflation. Why is this any different? Can you explain this to me? Because obviously, if you're making any kind of fiscal change to give people more money, it would arguably have an inflationary impact of some kind. So either it's a giveaway or it's not a giveaway. If it's a giveaway, there would be some inflation. If it's not a giveaway, then it doesn't make any difference either way.
Well, the discussion about inflationary effects to these sorts of giveaways seems to me slightly beside the point. Commonwealth did some research looking at the impact of inflation, for example, and we're finding that a lot of what's driving it is higher than average profits in particular sectors, particularly sectors that have a kind of concentrated market power. So I would argue that if what the government is concerned about is inflation, that looking at the kind of changes to the edges of our tax system and how much money ordinary people do or do not have to spend, you also see the government talking a lot about the need to be cautious around pay, for example. That's looking in the wrong direction, because that's not where the main inflationary pressures in our economy are coming from.
And finally, I want to ask you if this is really a continuation of austerity, because to go back to some numbers I mentioned a few minutes ago, the Chancellor is looking to cut projected increases for future public spending from 2% to 0.75%. Now, people hear increase. Okay, increase, great. So it's not austerity. Substantially, what does that mean? What does that mean in terms of austerity, in terms of the kinds of public services people can access?
Substantially, it does mean austerity. It means squeezes to budgets that already have been cut to the bone. And in particular, I think it's worth raising the point about the difference between day-to-day spending for departments and capital spending for departments. So as you've had government departments having to do more and more with less, what they're doing is they're taking that money from capital in budgets. They're taking that money from things like building more schools or building new hospitals and having to put it into the kind of day-to-day running costs, like, for example, paying doctors and nurses' salaries or paying teachers' salaries. And what that leads to is a situation where the underlying infrastructure in our public services is crumbling and in dire need of regeneration. But public services just can't afford to put that new money in because their budgets are still under so much pressure. You also mentioned earlier about the effects this is having on local councils, for example, and the number of those going bankrupt as well. I mean, we're just seeing throughout the economy, from the NHS to councils to schools, that we can't afford to keep having these incredibly constrained budgets. We need to have an injection of capital into our public services. And I think there's this sense both on the Tory side and on the Labour side that you can't do public investment until you get growth. I'd argue it's the reverse. You can't get growth until you do more public investment. And so that's where the government's priority should be.